like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president.
It was a job he never really wanted. General Dwight David Eisenhower seemed perfectly happy spending his golden years serving as president of Columbia University. Instead, he ended up becoming the 34th president of the United States.
The Republicans and the Democrats had no idea which political party he voted with. The truth was he hadn't voted until after he retired from the Army.
Both parties were trying to get him to run.
Yes, they were. As a matter of fact, Harry Truman volunteered twice to step down in Ike's favor if he'd run as a Democrat, which is pretty astonishing.
He was a five-star general and a two-term president.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike.
A lot of Americans liked Ike, but Susan Eisenhower loved him. Her president was also her grandfather.
That period is long gone, but I think my parents really helped us all by letting us think of him in two different ways. What I've done in this book is actually, for the first time in my life, bring it together. And so it was a bit of an emotional experience for me, actually, certainly by the end of the book.
Now, 60 years after he left office, Susan Eisenhower is sharing with the nation the story of one of America's most accomplished yet misunderstood presidents. Honesty, integrity, responsibility in war and in peace. That's how Ike led. Susan Eisenhower, thanks very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I have to ask, why after 60 years did you decide to write this book? And I know that it's 60 years without even doing the math because I was born just a couple of months before the end of his presidency, so you can tell who's about to turn 60. But I wonder why wait so long? Because obviously so many books have been written about his administration in the interim. Did you feel that you had something else you wanted to offer nobody else did?
Well, I think there are two things. I thought I had something to offer, which is a glimpse into the way Ike thought about things. Maybe that's a little presumptuous of me, but as I did the research, I was so surprised to see so many things that align with the way I was raised. And so I thought when scholars hit a brick wall and couldn't figure out why he did that, often I'd say, oh, I know. It used to be like this in our family, right? So I thought I'd add some of that, tried to make him into a real man, not just a policymaker and the rest of it. And then finally, I thought, because this book is dedicated to my strategy and leadership students at Gettysburg College, I wanted to make sure that rising generations know that we once had a very different kind of leadership in our country, and that they should expect more. They should expect more about everybody who goes into public life, and that this book is really about a different way of viewing maybe many of the same problems we have today.
And I suppose one of the advantages you had over those other biographers is that you had access to some family papers, diaries, letters, and things that they would not have had access to.
Well, it's ironic that of all people, I'm a foreign policy expert. I'd say national security is probably a better way to describe it. But I ended up being the only person who ever wrote a book about Mamie Eisenhower, now a book about Dwight Eisenhower. So I left a lot of the really intimate family stuff for my first book called Mrs. Ike. This one is more about how Eisenhower thought through problems during his wartime leadership and during his presidential leadership. And then I've interspersed it with chapters about who he was as a person, so that I hope by the end of the book, readers will feel like they come away with knowing who he is.
Is it difficult for you to be subjective, or do people think it might be difficult for you to be subjective?
Well, I think people think it's difficult. What they don't know is the rigorous training I got as a kid, which was we were taught absolutely to compartmentalize our relationship with him personally and also his policies. If not, one would not have been able to get through high school, I can tell you that, because there was a period when Dwight Eisenhower was still under attack from those who opposed him. But that period is long gone. But I think my parents really helped us all by letting us think of him in two different ways. What I've done in this book is actually, for the first time in my life, bring it together. And so it was a bit of an emotional experience for me, actually, certainly by the end of the book.
That probably brought up a lot of memories you hadn't thought of in a while.
That's right.
How old were you when he passed away? You were a young woman.
I was 17, moving towards 18. And so I had an opportunity to know him well. And after the White House years, my father moved us all up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where my grandparents were in retirement and my grandfather was writing his memoirs. My father, who was a wonderful writer himself and a military historian, served as part of the drafting team for those memoirs. And so we were over at my grandparents' farm probably 3 or 4 times a week.
Well, and on that score, I didn't realize that Ike was so eloquent. I don't know that I really could have even thought of a quote except for the whole military-industrial complex thing. But then you point out in the book that he had been a speechwriter at one point.
Oh, he was. He was Douglas MacArthur's speechwriter, and boy, was he opinionated about what kind of drafts ended up on his desk. I loved Arthur Larson saying that he was death on superlatives. You know, as a writer myself, I'm death on superlatives, too. I never want to see any of my students present a paper that uses the word incredible.
The United States Army presents The Big Picture.
Today, The Big Picture brings you another story in which the Army and the nation take particular pride. The story of Eisenhower, the soldier.
I guess we have to talk about his military career before his presidency because it seems like that shaped so much of the way he led as president and the way he led his life, really, even though he initially didn't want to be in the military, right?
Well, let's put it this way. He was a kid who just loved history, and he loved actually military history, but it never occurred to him to go to a service academy. He got tired of waiting to go to college because he'd spent several years putting his older brother through college. And then he wanted to go, and there was a bit of a lag between the next brother who would have been given that assignment. And then he realized he could go to West Point. If he could get into West Point, he'd get a free education from Uncle Sam, and he would be able to immerse himself in a subject that had interested him. But what did click for him was this sense of higher purpose. And he said later that it was that moment that changed for him when he went to West Point and pledged his allegiance to defend the Constitution of the United States.
He never served in combat, correct? I mean, he made it all the way up to general, obviously, and that's not that unusual, I suppose. It just depends when you're in the service. But he had a lot of empathy for the guys on the front line because of that, I think.
Well, he did. I mean, he commanded troops at Camp Colt in 1918, and he, was commanding men, just not actually in combat. But the point I make in this book is that for the job he had during World War II, which was to be the chief executive officer of the European theater, he didn't need to have combat experience. His job was about integrating all of this enormous amount of information that came into him, and then also factor into all of the information he didn't have because intelligence couldn't provide it. He had to make resource decisions, timeline decisions. So this is why there's an emphasis on strategic leadership in the book as opposed to operational leadership.
Yeah, and that brings me to one of what I thought was the most interesting things about his military service that really speaks to the character of the man was this unused communique, this note that he wrote just in case D-Day went badly. Tell me about that a little bit more.
Well, it's a remarkable story, and it's remarkable because, again, we feel like we don't have too many people in our public life on both sides of the aisle that are willing to take responsibility for their actions. In this case, Dwight Eisenhower is taking responsibility for everything, including the weather forecast. And what it really meant was that he understood that all of the decisions had been his, and that if the invasion failed, they would have no one to blame but Dwight Eisenhower. He carried this in case of failure note in his wallet, and it actually only surfaced a number of years ago.
He was really struck by what he found in the concentration camps, I guess to the point, if I recall from the book, where he made the villagers who, claimed, oh, we didn't know what was going on there, actually go out and bury some of the bodies.
He did, and he put that order out for a number of villages. I mean, that order stood. And this is where he gets to be a really interesting character for me, and I had to keep reminding myself I was related to him as I was researching this book. But this is, he could be as tough as he had to be. He really could. There's no question. I mean, there are times where it makes my hair stand on end. But I can tell you, I saw it myself. He was such a kind-hearted man. So I'm saying to myself as a professional, how do you marry that toughness with a soft inner self? And I think it takes tremendous amount of self-discipline. This is what the Army did for him. This is, frankly, what his father, who got out the hickory stick probably fairly regularly, did for him, too, which was to give him a sense of discipline and also a sense of gaining control over his inner space, which is a big theme in this book. That is what leadership is gaining control over your inner space so that you can carry things forward, not being impulsive, not having temper tantrums, not, doing a lot of things that we see today, and not being disrespectful even of adversaries, because Ike says in the book, he doesn't say it in my book, I quote him as saying that you never know if you're going to need your opposition to get something passed in Congress. So it's absolutely fruitless to be attacking them personally. And then he says, people have really long memories.
Now, he wasn't afraid to criticize people, but he just thought it was important not to criticize them publicly, which in today's climate is that's especially refreshing.
Exactly. So, and actually the other thing I learned from all this is that he was especially tough on his inner circle. And he didn't believe in this kind of tribalism. There was going to be no double standard here. Everybody had to play by the rules. As a matter of fact, my great uncle Milton, this is Ike's younger brother, had an assignment in the government and used to stay at the White House. Until he found out that Ike and Mamie were actually paying for him to stay in a room upstairs. They were repaying the taxpayer for the fact that the president's brother was staying overnight. And Ike expected that of himself, and his subordinates were expected to live up to the same standards, which brought about the sad and unfortunate resignation of Sherman Adams, who was chief of staff. But that's the way he wanted to do it, and that's the way it was going to be done.
Well, yeah, that reminds me from the book, sort of apropos of nothing, but that Mamie would use the family car to go back to Gettysburg and bring vegetables from the family garden to the White House.
It's all true. And then it turns out that Mamie's one of the best grocery coupon clippers on the planet. So she would, in the morning, before the White House staff came in, she'd go through all the papers with her scissors, and she'd have them all piled up, and then she'd well, listen, she wasn't able to redecorate the White House at all, not a room, because Ike says, we're going to balance this budget, and we're not going to be, living a different lifestyle than the taxpayers who are going to be contributing to balancing the budget. So that's the way it was. Poor Mamie. I think she would have loved to have decorated the White House, but she missed the boat on that one. She had to redirect her energy to their farm in Gettysburg.
Left it to Jackie Kennedy to do that work.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about the presidency of President Eisenhower. It's a job he really didn't want, at least initially, right?
Yeah, actually, I really enjoyed reading his diaries about all the people who came and asked him to run for president. And this is a secret diary that he never thought would probably be public, but he's writing things like some governor comes in to try and talk him into running, and he says, after all of those embarrassing comments about my duty to the country and this, he says, it made me want to dive under the table. The thing is that the war was so huge, so overwhelming. There were 16 million people in uniform, and then you add everybody who was working on the home front. So everybody knew his name. He was a victorious general in Europe. He had a big smile. He was good to his GIs. His GIs loved him, and he put together a landslide victory, which included a lot of Democrats who voted for him. But before he gets to the I'm going to run for president bid, the Republicans and the Democrats had no idea which political party he voted with. And actually, the truth was he hadn't voted until after he retired from the Army, because it was the tradition in those days that the Army didn't vote in elections. So he was kind of up for grabs.
Both parties were trying to get him to run.
Yes, they were. As a matter of fact, Harry Truman volunteered twice to step down in Ike's favor if he'd run as a Democrat, which is pretty astonishing. I've actually seen the letter where Truman makes reference to this and restates his offer. But Ike didn't want to do it, and he didn't think that being a military man was necessarily any qualification for being president. But I must say he brought enormous experience with him into the White House, so I think he wasn't thinking about that one correctly. Nevertheless, it made him probably the most nonpartisan president we certainly have had in the 20th century.
The middle way was his mantra.
That's right. And it's a kind of a charming idea, since we don't have much of a middle of the road anymore. As a matter of fact, one former senator told me that in the middle of the road, there are only dead raccoons and squirrels. So that kind of means that, well, I'm certainly political roadkill, so he would have been too today, but he had a power to bring people along. The middle of the road is where people can reconcile their differences over issues. The middle of the road is where everybody has a stake in what is being passed, where it isn't a matter of winners and losers, but everybody wins something. This is, it feels certainly, well, I miss it. I'll tell you that. I think we don't realize how absolutely dangerous the divisions are in our country today.
Yeah, I've heard you say that you believe that the disunity we have right now is not just unpleasant, but actually a national security threat.
I'll say it's a national security threat, and I wish it were my original idea, but Ike says it, and I quote him in the book about this is a great moment for an alert enemy. As some of those divisions began to emerge in the late 1950s, he was always, the image of our country has been one of the things that has been our saving grace. This image of a competent, vital democracy. And when we show that even in life and death situations, we can't unify our country, that's a major piece of intelligence for any foreign government.
One of the things I didn't realize in reading the book is that Ike, in 8 years, appointed 5 Supreme Court justices, and one of them was Earl Warren, who, is thought of as kind of, if nothing else, a very liberal conservative.
Right.
Talk about middle of the road.
Well, not only that, but during an election year, Ike even nominated and got approved a Democrat for the Supreme Court, because the idea behind that is that Eisenhower really believed that the court system, being a separate branch of government, really its credibility relied on the American public having trusted it's an apolitical organization. So when he didn't see the balance right in certain circuits or in the Supreme Court itself, he stepped in to try and recreate that balance if it ever existed before. Now, there's one exception to this. His court appointments, no white supremacists need apply. They had a very, very tough standard, because it was not only administration policy, but it was the objective to bring about social justice in this country. And so it's actually Eisenhower's court appointments that make a significant difference in the desegregation of the South. These judges went on for many, many years. And even John Lewis, who recently passed away, I had the wonderful opportunity of meeting and talking to him, and he brought up Ike's civil rights record, saying that how many times he had been saved by Eisenhower court appointments during his time during the civil rights movement. Most people don't realize in 1957, the Eisenhower administration got passed with, and by the way, the segregationists were the Democratic leadership in the Senate and the House. but passed the first piece of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It's a landmark bill. There were some compromises that had to be made, but that's really where legislatively things really begin to happen.
Well, that was something else you had in the book that really rang true because of the situation we find ourselves in today, is that he really thought peaceful protests were important.
Right. Well, first of all, he really believed in the American people. And what I mean by that is he really did believe in Abraham Lincoln's idea of the people by the people. And so demonstrations were people's rights to express themselves, and including going to the ballot box. So the one area that the Democratic leadership would not tolerate the 1957 bill was the Voting Rights Act. They came around pretty quick after he was gone, and it impressed me enormously, because I didn't know this myself until I researched the book, that Eisenhower actually supported the Democratic bills to bring about the Voting Rights Act, even though they had stopped him from putting it in his own legislation.
Do you think he's one of the most misunderstood presidents of the modern era? I think a lot of people probably, and I suppose I'm as guilty as the next person, think of that as just sort of a quiet, peaceful time, played a lot of golf, not much was going on. Clearly, that wasn't the case. I mean, he brought us NASA, he brought us the interstate highway system, which started right here in St. Louis, so at least we remember him for that. But so much has been forgotten about that time.
Well, it's interesting about being misunderstood. I think, first of all, the revisionism of Eisenhower's career starts in the late 80s. But when he left office, because of the intensity around certain issues, he was ranked fairly low down. And the last CNN poll put him at number 5. I think the reason he was misunderstood is nobody understood his leadership style. It wasn't about him getting attention for himself. It was about him meeting his goals. So he worked a lot behind the scenes, especially when it looked messy and upsetting for Americans. And that, in his world, would be described as the politically messy, unpleasant things that go on in making deals and the rest of it. I mean, he was a great believer in transparency, but not in allowing what tends to go on in Washington as looking unworthy. And by the way, Congress was a co-equal branch of government.
Well, and his style was to delegate a lot of the duties to other people, not to micromanage.
Well, he's not a micromanager, and he's completely correct about that. I think most people, it makes me laugh when people think that anybody can be president of the United States. I'd say it's still probably one of the toughest jobs, if not the toughest job on the planet. The number of things that require, reasoned analysis and the rest of it are overwhelming. And so no president can do it without a really strong team. And what I thought was interesting is that he put together a team of people of differing views on certain subjects. And he loved that pushback. He made the decisions, but he had his cabinet there to give him lots of pushback. By the way, not dissimilar to the way he ran his headquarters during the war.
Well, and I wonder if, because it seems like so much of the leadership qualities that he had and that grew with him during his wartime and military experience shaped his presidency, if we might be better served if a lot of our presidents had some sort of military service.
Yeah, it's something that has really been a sad chapter to close when the World War II veterans passed from the scene. Many very, very distinguished individuals were in Congress, of course, and even in the presidency. I think, though, that we're going to have a new generation of leaders that come out of Iraq and Afghanistan experiences. You're seeing a number of them run for public office, and they're going to bring a new dimension, I think, to our public life. And also, again, I wrote this book so that I hope that people who didn't know much about him would be inspired to become a little more involved in what's going on and not to be passive, because we've got a lot of very, very big long-term challenges in front of us. And it's going to require is going to require a lot more than what we have at the moment to find a way forward.
What was it like being the granddaughter of the president? Did you run around the White House when he was in office, or was that off limits?
Well, we did, and I'm reading about the renovation of the Rose Garden, which concerns me a bit because our pet parakeet is buried there, and Pete the parakeet died, and we gave it a dignified burial in that garden, which is known as the Rose Garden. We spent a lot of time, going up and down the back staircases, and my mother, who was a quintessentially terrific mother who did everything for everybody, helped us put on Christmas pageants on the second floor of the White House and the rest of it for my grandparents. And so I have many memories of that, including many of the people who served there. I stayed in touch with most of them, including the Secret Service and the White House staff, which was really a pleasure.
Just by way of wrapping up, do you think that he could win the presidency today, all things being equal?
Well, I think he could win the presidency today if the United States and our allies had just come out of an existential war. But the thing is, we're never going to have wars like that again. He was one of the very first people to understand we were never going to have a war like that again. If we have a war, there'll be many more casualties than the numbers we had in World War II, because it'll be a nuclear exchange if it's of that magnitude. Because that many people knew him, that many people trusted him, his name was that well known. If you are looking only among sort of an extraordinary character who might come from nowhere almost, I think it would be very hard. And I don't think that what he stood for is out of date. I just think we don't know how to do it anymore. And I hope we all take some time to realize that this country is only going to progress if we move forward together.
Well, perhaps your book will help get that word out there. It is certainly a very powerful story. Susan Eisenhower, thanks so much for the time. It was great to talk to you.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president.